Hi again, folks. Welcome back. And this week we will be discussing the state. And the learning outcomes for this week. We'll explain the concept of the state. We'll define government, population, legitimacy, territory, and sovereignty. We'll summarize the history of the modern state. We'll compare how modern states differ. We'll understand the differences between nation and state. And we'll analyze the condition of the modern state today. All right, so what is a state? This can be a little confusing from an American perspective because we call our regional governments in the United States states. And it's because as the United States formed, it initially was a collection of sovereign states that was part of a confederation. But after the Constitution was drafted and ratified, the United States became a federal structure. So in a sense, the United States is a single state. I know that can be a little bit confusing. So when we talk about states in the context of this course and in political science, we're we're using that term for countries in the international system. So what defines a state? Government, that states have governments that are the recognized authority, and they deal with the governments of other states. States have a defined population that is within a defined territory. States are considered legitimate. They're recognized by their resident and other states as having authority within their territory. Again, states have a fixed territory. They're marked by borders and control of the movement of people, money, and goods. And states have sovereignty over the territory. That means that they're the sole authority to impose laws and taxes. Nobody's wondering, okay, who's really in charge? Okay, here are those textbook definitions. I already had a chance to discuss the state and sovereignty. I try to use language as close to the reading as possible so that there's not confusion. Let's take a minute, though, and discuss the concept of the citizen. This is a full member of the state who is entitled to the rights and subject to the responsibilities associated with being a member of that state. In the modern era, citizenship is confirmed by documents such as passports or an identity card or a social security number, as we would use in the United States. Let's discuss where this concept of the state comes from. I mean, there's been aspects of the state that has existed since the ancient world, but the modern state emerges out of the 30 Years' War and the 1648 Peace of Westphalia, and the idea that these territorial defined states have the leaders have sovereign authority within their states. They're in control. Individual states are entitled to political self-determination. They shouldn't be overly influenced by external empires or religious leaders. And of course, the idea here is that this would create greater stability than what existed during this long period of conflict. The concept of natural rights would support the development of the modern state. That is, the leaders, the rulers of states are responsible to their citizenry. And that doesn't seem particularly revolutionary, I guess, today, but at the time it did, So what the classic concept of a monarch is that they have subjects, and those subjects are their property within their territory. Well, the idea of natural rights is the reverse of that, which is that people have certain rights just because they're human. These rights are given to them by nature or God or whatever your belief system is. And government cannot take those away. Government has a responsibility to protect those natural rights. There's also the concept that political leaders, governmental leaders, they have a responsibility to the citizenry ultimately. And this is fueled by the Enlightenment thinking of the 1700s and the writings of John Locke, and we'll discuss him here in a little bit. Some other components of the state. First of all, the state is essential, or ultimately proved to be essential, in the large-scale warfare of the 20th century. So the modern state allowed for conditions of total war, World War I, to a much greater extent World War II, where entire populations are engaged in fighting other entire populations of other states. That's something that we've become accustomed to, but before the evolution of the modern state and then the technology of modern warfare, that didn't exist. Also, the modern state were essential in creating welfare programs, what we refer to as the welfare state, which emerged from conflicts during the 20th century and depression. So aspects of and responsibilities of the state to provide health care, to provide pensions, economic security for their citizens. These emerge out of the Great Depression. They emerge out of the devastation of World War II. And now, particularly in economically advanced and developed countries, are seen as essential functions of the modern state. To spend a little bit more time with this concept of natural rights, John Locke, an early Enlightenment figure, argues that governments and the state exist for the people being governed. And again, this is a revolutionary idea, particularly to monarchs who see their subjects as their property, and that the powers of a state are limited through an informal social contract, that government only exists ultimately to serve the citizenry. So that is a contract between the leaders and the people that they governed. And so the leaders are dependent on popular consent for their leadership. Locke also advanced the idea that people are entitled to life, liberty, and property. And of course, Thomas Jefferson liberally borrowed that term and said that people or individuals are entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And of course, with regard to Jefferson, he was saying that at the time when he was a plantation owner and a slave owner. But many of the concepts that would support the Declaration of Independence in the United States and the revolution in France, these were moored in the ideals of the Enlightenment, and in particular, the concept of natural rights. So again, the modern state is a relatively new idea emerging out of the wreckage of the 30 Years' War. And it's not to say that there weren't governing structures, there weren't government, there weren't political systems before the modern state emerged. Of course not. Before that, we saw much more loosely integrated large empires like the Roman Empire. We saw independent city-states, powerful city-states, empires. We saw that also in the Americas, in the Mayan-ruled part of what is today Mexico. Obviously, monarchies, powerful churches like the Catholic Church that wielded authority across the continent, and so on. Powerful landowners, tribes. So when we think about a system of powerful landowners, we think of feudalism, and this provides the model for the modern state. So if you think about it, a feudal lord will control their territory, and there may be an economy and a border or a walled area that encloses this territory. So Karl Marx wrote that for feudal lords, their estate was their state. This is the prototype for what became the state system. And as I'm sure is no shock to you, European states engage in a competition to divide up the world, to conquer territory for a diversity of reasons. Sometimes it's to settle, sometimes it's to extract natural resources, sometimes it's both. And so Europe exports this concept of the state to the territories that it conquers. So we see a large number of states created during certain periods of time, waves of new state creation. First wave, early 19th century. This is largely in the Americas and Central and South America and Mexico, where the Spanish Empire, the Portuguese Empire is waning in influence, and their colonies are gaining independence and the ability to govern themselves. Second wave being after World War I. The map that resulted after World War I is largely recognizable today. Before that, we had larger empires, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, and today's map much more closely mirrors what we saw in the aftermath of World War I. So there's a large number of states that were created there. Third wave, this largely occurs after World War II as former colonial powers, the British, the French, no longer had the ability to administer their colonies in Africa and Asia. And of course, there was rising independent movements at the very same time. So these colonial powers no longer had the ability or inclination to put down independence movements. And this begins the final period of colonial empires. So they don't all end right after World War II, but that starts this final process that ultimately results in the end of European colonial empires. And of course, the fourth wave is due to the breakup of the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia and the creation of the many states that come with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Iron Curtain and the Soviet Union as a whole. And so out of this, there's a lot of constitution making. Many of these states that used to be members of the former Soviet Union would adopt presidential systems of government similar to what you see, or what we see in the United States of America. And they've had varying degrees of success in terms of their transition to more democratic systems of government. And in the case of Russia, there has been, a great deal of democratic backsliding, and ultimately today they're very much an authoritarian system, not a communist authoritarian system, but certainly not a democratic system. However, former states that were in the Soviet sphere of influence have made the transition to democratic states, like the Czech Republic, for example. Currently, there are 193 members of the United Nations, and 37 has joined since the fall of the Soviet Union in 1990. So that was the last major wave where we saw a great deal of state creation. There's also several states that are not official members of the United Nations, but have many of the characteristics of an independent state. So, it really sort of depends on what your definition of a state is to get to that precise number of how many there are in the world. Keep in mind that newer states are likely to be considered soft. Their institutions have not developed. Their judicial system, criminal justice system, courts, their legislature, the ability to check the power of the executive. These are things that develop over time, if at all. This is just a figure from your textbook that goes over those different waves of state creation. Of course, there's a great deal of diversity between states, between countries in the world. There are very small states in terms of population, in terms of territory, like Barbados. There are states that are really just city-states, like Singapore, that is a little more than a city. And of course, there are larger states like China and the United States and others that have, in the case of China, well over 1 billion people. In the case of the United States, 320 million or so. There are also quasi-states that exist. They're recognized under international law, but their governments really don't control all the territory that is within their borders. An example of this would be Afghanistan, where the government there in Afghanistan doesn't really control much outside of the capital city of Kabul. There are also de facto states that aren't recognized under international law, even though they control territory and provide some degree of governance. So they exist in fact or de facto states rather than under international law. An example of this has been Kurdish regions of Iraq. That's technically a territory of Iraq, but in many cases Iraqi Kurdistan governs itself. Palestinian-controlled areas, in many cases, are not recognized but provide governance within those areas, but with the ultimate goal of recognition as an independent state. So those would be some example of de facto states that aren't recognized legally. Of course, there's also a lot of diversity when it comes to the income and wealth of states. And you might also realize here there's a relationship between high income states and democratization. So we tend to see that states that have higher levels of overall income, and that income isn't just concentrated into the hands of the few, that there's a large middle class. When you see those high income states with higher levels of income equality, a larger middle class, you tend to see higher levels of democracy and democratic institutions. And I think this table demonstrates that. We often use the terms nation and state interchangeably, and we shouldn't, because they mean distinct things, although they're related. The concept of the state, obviously, and we discussed already, we're talking about a clear territory. It's got defined borders. It has a clear government. That government has sovereignty. They're seen as the ultimate decision makers within that territory. Other states recognize that state as a state. So those are some of the characteristics of the state, which we've already explored. Nations describe a group of people. So you think about, say, a Native American nation, the Cherokee Nation. That describes a group of people. Now, this concept can be a little bit murky because this group of people could have historical connections, they could have cultural connections, they could have linguistic connections, or some combination of all these things. And that's why some people in the United States, we engage in a conversation, is the United States a multinational state, or is it, as we say in the Pledge of Allegiance, one nation under God? Now, we know that people who immigrated to the United States came from a lot of cultural backgrounds, a lot of linguistic backgrounds. And that's one of the reasons why we have sort of a hyphenated notion of nationality in the United States, right? Irish Americans, Asian Americans, and so on, Chinese Americans, and so on, African Americans. So the idea that you can be kind of this and that. But an interesting broader debate is, what are the characteristics of American nationalism? Is there such thing as a single American nation, or are we a multinational state, a collection of distinct different national identities? That's kind of a separate discussion. Closely intertwined with the concept of the nation is self-determination. There are many nations within the world that don't have their own state. And so a nation will seek self-determination, the ability to possess its own government, and maybe its own territory. And we see that in Palestinian-controlled territories today. We see that in Kurdish-controlled territories, that there are many people who are seeking self-determination, seeking independence based on their national identity. And we also see this to some extent too in the United States with those groups that might want to pull away from the United States. Sometimes we'll see people who want to, for example, maybe have Alaska secede and govern itself. The state of Texas was once the Republic of Texas, and so there remains some sentiment out there that perhaps Texas would like to be independent again. So we do see that too in the United States and in other countries. There's sometimes secessionist movements that are seeking self-determination. Well, the concept of nationalism is that, it's a glorification of the nation. In many cases, it could be cultural terms, it could be in racial terms. And sometimes this is used as justification to create one's own state or to conquer the states of others and expand the state. So when we take a look at, for example, conflicts in Europe in World War I and World War II, we see a high degree of German nationalism, sort of an attempt to expand German territory, or in the case of World War II, reclaim German territory that was lost in World War I and then expand further. And that was all done on the basis of sort of a nationalist argument that the German people had the right to rule these territories and the right to rule Europe based on national characteristics. I already explored that concept of nationalism, although just to talk about it a little bit further, nationalism can be something that is purely based on forming an independent state and governing itself. But nationalism can also be used, as I mentioned earlier, as a justification to expand, and that nation has a right to rule beyond its existing borders. The concept of nation state means that there is a dominant nation within a state, and those citizens share a common identity, and that's could be linguistic, historical, a sort of a genetic similarity. An example of this would be Japan. So if you take a look at Japan, the vast majority of people are of Japanese descent. 90 some percent speaking Japanese. With a shared culture, shared history, and that would be a classic example of a nation state. Now, a multinational state is one consisting of very clear different national groups. And a good example of this would be Iraq. So in Iraq, you have the Sunni nation, you have the Shia nation, you have the Kurd nation, and they're within a single state. But each one of them, if you were to ask somebody, hey, who are you? Define yourself. They would probably identify as a Kurd or Shia or Sunni. Now, again, the conversation in the United States is an interesting one. Many people would identify as an American, although, of course, a lot of people might identify as a German American or an Irish American or African American or Chinese American and so forth. A few other concepts I want to make sure to touch on. The idea of a security state. As I mentioned earlier in the class, fundamental role for government is providing basic security and order. However, leaders may want to go too far, right, and to monitor its citizens through videotaping, through monitoring phone call, mail, internet use. We tend to see this more in authoritarian regimes or less democratic regimes. And then also there's a drive to do this during times of crisis. So after 9/11 in the United States, there was much more willingness to accept the monitoring of phone calls and more intrusive government action to create more security. States are also members of international organizations like the United Nations. Things like the World Bank, or these large organizations that don't have individual members like you or me, but their members are states. And also, I want you to be familiar with the concept of a failed state. What happens when the basic properties of a state break down, where there is no monopoly on the use of power, where it is difficult to tell who's actually in control, when you could have block by block that's controlled by different warlords? And here are some examples of states recently that have collapsed. Somalia would be a classic example. Many people from Somalia have settled in Minnesota and had the experience of being in relocation camps and refugee camps because the basic properties of the state collapsed. So it's important to recognize, in this discussion, there's such thing as too much power in the hands of the state, and that's that talk around the security state. And of course, there's problems when the state doesn't have the power to carry out its basic function, and that's what we're referring to as a failed state. As I mentioned before, there was a world before the current state system. There will be a world after our current state system. And it's an interesting discussion, what's that going to look like? How long will states endure? Will they transition into something else? Will our system entirely change? I'm not going to go through each of these, but there are some real critiques to the current state system. I mean, in one way, in one sense, they make us more tribal, right? We're more likely to get into war with each other, and the powers of the state make total war more likely. A whole population going to war against another entire population. States put up borders. They make it more difficult to trade, more difficult for people to move around. And that handicaps efficiency and innovation when people are limited in that way. Um, States too often are unable to meet the demands of their residents for security, justice, prosperity, human rights, and because states control borders, it can be very difficult for those people to vote with their feet and go somewhere else where their demands will be met. To wrap things up, the state lies at the heart of government politics, which is why it's important to understand its features and evolution. All states have five defining qualities: government, population, legitimacy, territory, and sovereignty. The modern state was born in Europe, and its form was exported to the rest of the world by imperial powers. States differ from one another in terms of their population, the reach of their political authority, and their income. A nation is different from a state. These are separate terms, and you should be able to identify the differences. Although they do overlap in ways, like the term nation state, when you have a state that is controlled by a single nation. Now, the condition of the current state system is debatable. Some argue that states are going to remain strong, others that they're declining, and some just say that they're changing or evolving. All right, here are guiding questions for the week. Make sure that you post one substantive original post and at least two responses to on-topic posts of your classmates. Do that in the weekly discussion area. As always, if you have any questions about your progress in the course or any of the material or whatever, please take advantage of office hours or shoot me an email. Have a great week.